They told you madness runs in blood like a family heirloom. But what they never told you is that some bloodlines were never meant to exist. That behind some family names are covenants older than any scripture, sealed in flesh, inked in insanity, and baptized in shadow. And the Moorfields? They were not just haunted by their past, they were bound to it, like cattle tethered to an altar. You're about to see why. Massachusetts, 1883. The wind wasn't just cold that autumn, it bit. It howled through the forest with a voice, as if the trees themselves remembered things the living had long buried. And down that forgotten road came Jonathan Moorfield, disgraced, ruined, exiled, carrying the weight of a name that history had tried to forget. They called it inheritance. What he found was something else entirely. You've heard the phrase "the house remembers." But what if it's not just a metaphor? What if walls really do watch and whisper back? What if the blood soaked into the floorboards doesn't rest, but feeds something ancient below? Jonathan's family built that mansion in 1790, after his ancestor Elijah purchased the land for cheap from a native tribe. Why cheap? Because they begged him not to build there. Because the land itself was wrong. They said it was a place where the veil thins, where things dream beneath the soil. But Elijah, proud, hungry, certain, ignored them. Just like every Moorfield man after him, when Jonathan arrived, the house was rotting but standing, like a corpse that hadn't realized it was dead. Locals refused to go near it. The last carriage driver who dropped someone off there never took a fare again. They whispered about what happens to men who stay too long under its roof. Voices, faces in the walls, dreams that taste like blood. But Jonathan, stripped of everything else, had nowhere left to go. And sometimes when a man is broken, he becomes the perfect vessel. The first night, he found the diaries, crumbling pages written by men who bore his face, and all lost their minds before the age of 36. Elijah, Jeremiah, William, all of them spoke of visions, of the stone, of the basement. They called it a curse, but their words were hungry, reverent. And then, a pattern: every man in his line heard the voices, and eventually obeyed them. That's when it began for Jonathan. The footsteps, the dragging sound on the floor above while he sat alone, the reflection in the mirror that wasn't his, the sudden cold in the dead of night, as if the house were breathing on his neck. But it wasn't until he descended into the basement, until he saw the altar, the stone, that he felt it, the pull, a magnetic hunger from something older than human time. The black stone, it didn't shine. It swallowed light. And when Jonathan stood before it, it whispered his name, not as a stranger, but as kin. It said, "Welcome home." You see, this isn't just a haunted house story. That's for children. This is about power, control, bloodlines built as channels for something buried, something waiting. Madness wasn't the disease. It was the doorway. You've been lied to your whole life, about history, about family, about where evil comes from. You were taught that madness is internal, a misfiring of chemicals, a tragic flaw. But what if it's not? What if some minds are infected, not by trauma, but by inheritance? What if blood can carry not just traits, but contracts? The Moorfields weren't unlucky. They were chosen, groomed, bred. The house didn't make them mad, it revealed what was already seated inside them. You want to know why they all died the same way? Because at some point, each one went into the basement. Each one heard the voice, each one saw the truth, and couldn't live with it. But here's the part that matters. The stone didn't cause their madness. It awakened something that had always been there, in them. And maybe in you. There are families all over the world with forgotten names, erased records, burned photos, because someone, somewhere, knew that truth was dangerous. But some names survive. Moorfield is one of them. And that house, it wasn't built as a home. It was a shrine. Ask yourself, why does every generation of this bloodline follow the same descent? Why the age 35? Why the same dreams, the same deaths, the same altar? Because something ancient made a pact with their ancestor. And blood was the price. And now, the blood calls again. There are places in the world that were never meant to be settled. Places older than the maps that chart them. Places where the ground remembers, where the trees lean inward as if trying to smother secrets the wind dares not carry. Blackwood was one of those places, and the Moorfield estate? It was not so much. Built as it was summoned, pulled up from the soil like a memory refusing to stay buried. The locals had long since learned to speak softly about the Moorfields, if they spoke of them at all. For over a century, every son of that family who stepped through the mansion's doors had come apart at the seams. And yet, no matter how many fell to madness, the bloodline endured. As if something needed it to. As if their suffering was the cost of continuity. But the real question was never why they went mad. It was why the madness always began after they returned to the house. Jonathan learned that quickly. Within 48 hours of unlocking the gates, he no longer trusted the shape of his own shadow. He'd glance at a mirror and see a figure behind him. That disappeared when he turned. The scent of earth, cold, wet, ancient, clung to him like a second skin. He dreamed of a spiral staircase carved in bone. And always the whispering. Never loud, never urgent. Just patient. Like a whisper that had waited generations to be heard. In the town of Blackwood, Jonathan searched for answers. But the townspeople offer him only sideways glances and closed doors. Until one man, Harold Simmons, finally gave him the truth that shattered everything. The land was cursed long before the Moorfields touched it. The native Wampanoag warned Elijah Moorfield that he was trespassing on the resting place of those who sleep beneath. Spirits, entities, gods, number. One knew. What was certain was this: something ancient had been disturbed when the basement was dug. And something unnatural had entered the Moorfield bloodline the moment Elijah touched that black stone. Harold called it the hunger, said it fed not on flesh, but on will. It didn't possess you all at once. That would be too easy to resist. No, it crept in through thoughts, through doubt, through guilt. It made you question your memories, distort your past, until finally it spoke to you in your own voice. That's how it worked. It didn't scream. It whispered. Jonathan went back to the mansion that night and stood before the mirror in the main hall. He stared into his own eyes for what felt like hours, and something stared back, not a reflection, but a presence. As if the mirror remembered every Moorfield who had looked into it before they cracked. He began to read more of the diaries, not just his father's, but his grandfather's and his great-grandfather's. The same words echoed through the centuries. It watches, it waits, it promises. Every man believed he was the one who could control it. And every one of them ended the same way, dead insane, or missing. But here's where the story turns, because Jonathan wasn't just any heir, he was the last. And something about that ... woke the stone. For the first time in over a century, the altar room grew warm to the touch. The stone pulsed in a rhythm that matched Jonathan's heartbeat. And with each passing hour, the house began to shift. Subtly, doors no longer opened the way they had. Rooms extended deeper. Staircases now led to landings that hadn't existed the day before. Time folded. Space warped. The mansion was alive, and it was reconfiguring itself around him. This wasn't madness. This was transformation. That's when the letters started appearing. Pages written in a hand that wasn't his, placed on his nightstand while he slept. Always unsigned, always in black ink. They said things like, "You must remember what your blood forgot," or "The body is only the key, the mind is the gate." And most chilling, the altar is not the end. It is only the beginning. But who was writing them? At first, he thought perhaps the townspeople, then maybe his own mind. But deep down he knew it was the ones who came before. His ancestors, those who had fallen, were still in the house, not as spirits, no. As impressions, echoes, not of who they were, but what they became. Because once you bond with the stone, your soul is no longer your own. The diaries proved it. Elijah wrote in English at first, then in Latin, then in a language that didn't exist. Symbols and glyphs that twisted the eye. The later entries were not words at all, but geometric spirals, diagrams of rituals, charts of constellations that had never been mapped. They weren't losing their minds. They were rewriting them, becoming something other. And now, it was Jonathan's turn. He tried to leave. He packed a bag, reached the gate, only to find the road had disappeared. Fog covered everything. The path he walked a day ago now led to nowhere. The mansion stood behind him like a judge, silent and waiting. It had closed the door on the world. And he understood then. The house did not want him to leave, not until he finished it. Before we go deeper, before we cross the threshold you can't come back from, I need you to prove you're not just watching this. I need you to show. You understand that in the comments. Write this phrase twice. The blood remembers, the house obeys. Write it once to acknowledge the past. Write it again to lock in the transformation. This isn't entertainment. It's initiation, because if you keep watching, you don't come back the same. The first thing to go was the light. Jonathan began to notice that candles burned faster in certain rooms. Oil lamps sputtered, even when full. Shadows didn't just stretch, they multiplied. The dark had weight now, presence. He could feel it pressing on him in doorways, in mirrors, especially near the basement door. The stone didn't like illumination. It preferred silence, dusk, fog, that thin veil between sleeping and waking where things could whisper without words. He didn't sleep anymore, not really. Each time his eyes closed, he was there again, back in the chamber with the altar, surrounded by his ancestors in a circle. They wore robes that looked stitched from flesh. Their eyes were gone, replaced with pits of black glass. But they chanted in unison, their mouths open in eternal devotion to something just beyond the edge of vision. The sound, if it was sound, didn't pass through his ears. It curled around his spine. He stopped eating. His body rejected normal food. Bread turned bitter in his mouth. Water felt thick like syrup. But when he stood in the basement, he felt fed. Not full, but stabilized. The way a wire feels when it connects to a hidden current. Alive, controlled. That was when the transformation truly began. The mansion started, showing him things. It began with the doors. There was a hallway that hadn't been there before. Narrow, lined with rotting portraits of people he didn't recognize. Men and women with Moorfield eyes but different names scrawled beneath them. Gideon Axton, Lucilla Vale, Father Karen. Bloodline deviants maybe, bastards, or worse. Those who took the stone's path and shed their names entirely. Each portrait had been slashed down the middle, as if they'd tried to escape. Then came the voices. No longer whispers. Now they spoke in full sentences, in perfect unison. We've waited for the completion. You are the bridge. Open the gate. He found himself drawn again and again. To the attic, the same place his father had ended his life. Dust hung in the air like ash. And in the corner, beneath a collapsed beam, he found a wooden box. Inside were artifacts, a lock of hair, a shard of obsidian, and a sealed parchment. He unfolded it and read, "The blood must be unlocked. The vessel must remember. Pain is the key." That night, he opened a vein. Not in desperation. In ritual, he smeared the blood on the diary pages, on the walls, and finally, on the stone. And the stone responded. It grew warm. It hummed. And then, the mansion breathed. The floor pulsed once, like a heart muscle convulsing. Walls groaned, portraits tilted. The windows fogged from the inside, even though the air was frigid. Jonathan collapsed to his knees as visions flooded his mind. He saw Elijah standing before a native shaman, demanding the land. He saw the moment. The altar was built, not by Moorfields, but by something else, something not human, long before the arrival of settlers. He saw the pact, the blood promise, that as long as the line continued, the gate would remain open. Jonathan was never the heir. He was the final piece, the completion, and the price. His skin began to itch, burn. He stripped off his shirt and saw symbols forming on his chest. The same ones carved into the basement walls, not tattooed, not drawn, burned from the inside out, as if the blood beneath his skin remembered what his mind could not. His scream echoed through the house, not in fear, but in surrender. The house didn't just want him to accept his legacy, it wanted him to fulfill it. He started hearing music, not from any known instrument. A low, droning chord made of breath and bone and distance. It came from the basement. Always the basement. He tried to resist, tried to stay upstairs, but he would always wake up there. In front of the altar, kneeling, drenched in sweat and soil and tears, he didn't remember crying. And then came the visitors. One night, he looked out the window and saw a figure standing just beyond the gate. Men in robes, silent, still, watching. When he blinked, they were closer. He bolted the doors, covered the windows, but they were inside anyway, never seen. Only heard the soft thud of footsteps on wet wood, the sigh of breath behind his ear, a handprint on the glass from the inside. They were the keepers, the others, bound to the stone long ago, waiting for the final blood to awaken the gate fully. And Jonathan, broken and chosen, was nearing the point of no return. He tried writing to Thaddeus Green, the lawyer who had arranged his inheritance, but the letters burned in his hand before he could finish. The ink turned to ash. The paper withered. The house would allow no escape. He was no longer alone in his body. Thoughts came, unbidden, ritual symbols he didn't know how to draw, appearing on the margins of books. Words in dead languages whispered from his own mouth as he slept. He started pacing at night, not of his own will, but as if something inside was testing the limbs, flexing, practicing. The transformation was nearly complete, but what was he becoming? A priest? A host? Or the gate itself? The stone had chosen, and Jonathan had bled. There was a reason the Moorfield house had no blueprints. Local records showed its construction in 1822, but no architect was ever named. No builder's logs, no supplier invoices. It simply was. Like it had always been there, waiting to be discovered. The surrounding town of Bellinmoor, long since reduced to a scattering of husks and grave markers, called it the Crooked Place. A structure that looked noble from a distance, but warped the closer you came. Windows that didn't align. Hallways that narrowed without warning. Doors that opened to walls. Or to nothing at all. Jonathan began mapping the interior out of desperation. What started as a rational attempt to reclaim control quickly turned into an obsession. He drew the mansion over and over, but it changed with each sketch. A staircase that wasn't there before. A room behind the library shelves that moved when unobserved. Symbols etched into the ceiling beams, crude spirals, intersecting triangles, and a motif of a crowned skull with roots instead of veins. He wasn't creating a map. He was uncovering one. The house had grown over centuries, not upward or outward, but inward. He found hidden rooms sealed behind false fireplaces. Corridors lined with bone, real bone, not decorative, each piece marked with carvings. He found a nursery, abandoned and silent, with 7 tiny beds, all facing east. Above them, scrawled in red pigment, the blood remembers. There were no birth certificates for the children. No records. Just names scratched into the walls. some in English, some in languages Jonathan couldn't even identify. He found himself drawn to one particular room, the oldest part of the mansion. A stone-walled chamber buried beneath the wine cellar, reachable only by crawling through a hole no wider than a child's shoulders. Inside, there was no dust, no cobwebs, just cold silence and a single artifact, a cradle made entirely of black. Iron dot inside it, a shriveled, leathery husk of something once human, infant-sized, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its jaw was fused shut, and its eye sockets were empty, but not hollow. Instead, packed with salt, a note lay at its feet. The price must be paid in reverse. Jonathan stumbled back, vomited, and crawled out. But the room followed him. That night, he dreamed he was the child in the cradle, unable to scream, watching his ancestors as they knelt around him in prayer to something vast and other. He could feel the salt burning into his skull, preserving the silence, trapping the soul. He awoke with salt in his mouth. Each night after that, more rooms appeared. One was filled entirely with broken mirrors, but each one reflected not his face, but his father's corpse hanging in the attic, though sometimes it twitched. Another room contained nothing but a pit filled with ink. When he dropped a book into it, he heard it scream. The ink rose in bubbles and spelled a word on the surface: yours. The house wasn't haunted, it was alive, not in the way animals are alive, but like a ritual is alive, like fire is alive. It had intention, hunger, and Jonathan was both the key and the offering. He began referring to the mansion as her. She began responding. When he whispered to the walls, they whispered back. When he bled on the stone, it grew warm. When he sang the hymns from the diary, written in a dialect resembling ancient Chaldean, she moved. Furniture shifted. Doors clicked open. Lights flickered in sequences, like blinking eyes. He was no longer afraid. He was in awe. Until he found the journal. Not his journal. Another got buried beneath the floorboards of the master bedroom, wrapped in waxed cloth and bound with a leather strap. The cover was branded with the same crowned skull symbol. Inside were entries from Elijah Moorfield, the patriarch, written in unsteady, collapsing hand. It chronicled his descent into the pact, the rituals, the voices that promised him bloodline power if he sealed the altar with sacrifice, and then a passage that chilled Jonathan more than any shadow could. The house is not ours. We are hers. She was here long before us. We do not own the stone, we merely feed it. Every 100 years, it must remember. Every 100 years, a Moorfield must give flesh. Jonathan did the math. Exactly 100 years since the last documented Moorfield sacrifice. A young woman named Eliza, who vanished in 1925. A single photograph of her existed in the attic, showing her standing beside a man whose face had been scratched out violently. On the back, the next gatekeeper must be bound by love or blood. He wasn't chosen at random. He was summoned. To pay. To unlock. To become. The bloodline was never cursed. It was never madness. It was obedience. It began with the birds. First, the absence. No crows, no morning chirps. Just silence so complete, it rang. Then, 3 dead sparrows on the front step, their eyes gouged, beaks sewn shut with hair, human hair. Jonathan stared at them too long. Not because of the horror, but because something in his chest stirred. A memory he didn't have. He began hearing the knocking again, not at the door, but inside the walls. 3 short knocks, then 2. Then silence, then again 3. Morse code? No, a pattern. Older than that. Ritual tapping. And then, the smell. Copper and smoke. She was calling. The Moorfield house no longer felt like a home. It was a cathedral of something blasphemous. A vessel. And Jonathan? He had passed the test. Now came the cost. In the dining hall. A room. he swore didn't exist a week ago. He found the altar again. The black stone, warm to the touch. Above it, etched into the rafters, were the words, "In blood, remembrance. In bone, dominion." On the altar, a set of tools. A knife, a quill. He knew what he had to do. That's the most terrifying part. He didn't decide. He remembered. And so he made the first offering, his own tooth. He pulled it out by hand. No sedation, no hesitation. Placed it in the bowl. Blood filled the crevices. The house sighed. Doors opened upstairs. A door that hadn't opened in decades. Inside, a child's room, untouched since the 1800s. Toys carved from bone. Dolls with no faces. And in the corner, a mirror draped in cloth. Jonathan pulled it down. What he saw wasn't his reflection. It was Elijah. Standing behind him. Smiling. He spun around. Empty room. But in the mirror, Elijah remained, mouth moving, whispering something over and over. Jonathan pressed his hand to the glass, cold, but when he looked down, his palm was bleeding. The mirror had taken skin, and written with it, across the glass in perfect cursive, "You are next. You are ready." That night, Jonathan had the dream. The same dream every Moorfield descendant recorded before their death. The field of black flowers, the sky of red ash. A circle of stone figures. Blind, tall, faceless, chanting in a language he knew but didn't understand. In the center, the altar. On it, himself. Eyes open, mouth sealed shut. Just like the cradle child. When he awoke, his tongue was black. His fingers numb. She was preparing him. Not to kill, but to transform. You see, this story isn't about ghosts. It's about inheritance. Not the money, not the mansion, but the role. Every bloodline has a purpose in the hidden world. The Moorfields were never farmers, never scholars. They were vessels, designed to keep something old and sleeping. Fed. Jonathan's mistake wasn't returning. It was accepting. He stopped fighting. He let the madness become clarity, and that's when he saw the door. A black iron thing at the end of a hallway that didn't exist yesterday, with no handle. No lock. Just a single sentence carved across its surface. Only the bound may enter. He knew what that meant. The ritual was incomplete. House would not open fully. Until he made a blood offering that wasn't his. It needed another Moorfield, or someone bound by love. His sister, Clara, the only other living descendant. Estranged, innocent. And now invited. Because behind that door, Jonathan believed, was the truth. Not metaphor, not madness. Proof. And so he wrote her a letter, told her he was dying. That he needed her. That he had something she must see. And she foolishly said, yes. She would arrive in 7 days. The house waited. So did the altar. And Jonathan, now fully awakened, stood at the edge of the final threshold, smiling with cracked lips. Because love is the oldest sacrifice. Clara never liked old places. She said they carried too much silence. Growing up, she avoided the attic, the cellar, even her own dreams. She was born different from the others. Where Jonathan buried, she escaped. She studied psychology, believed in diagnoses, in science. She made sense of pain by dissecting it. So when she stepped onto the warped front porch of Moorfield House, she felt something shift. Not in the house, but in herself. A coldness that didn't come from fear, but from familiarity. As though a voice inside her had exhaled after years of silence. Jonathan greeted her with a hug that lingered too long. He was thinner, pale, eyes like unlit oil lamps. His voice, too measured, like every syllable had been practiced. The house loomed behind him, groaning with wood and time. You didn't tell me it was this bad, Clara whispered. Jonathan smiled. I didn't want you to come if I told the truth. Inside, the air was wrong, sweet and metallic. The wallpaper seemed to pulse. Clara thought it was her imagination until she touched it, and it felt warm. As if the house were breathing, she tried to laugh it off. She tried to ask about plumbing and heating and plans to sell the place. But Jonathan kept steering the conversation toward the past. Old family journals. Unexplained gaps in the bloodline. Stories from their great-grandfather Elijah that had never been written down, only whispered. You remember the cradle in the attic? He asked at dinner. Clara froze. She hadn't remembered it. Until now. A cradle of black iron. A thing she swore was just a nightmare from childhood. She had cried for days after seeing it. Screamed that it watched her. She never told anyone that. Not even Jonathan. And yet, he knew. You dreamed it too, he said. It wasn't a question. That night, she explored the halls alone. Jonathan had gone to the study, muttering about alignments and the old stair. She wandered into the eastern wing, which had always been locked growing up. Now, it was open. The nursery still stood, dustless, preserved, 7 beds. A cracked doll on the floor with no eyes and stitched lips. She turned to leave, but the door had vanished. No sound. No creak, just gone. She panicked, slammed her hands on the wall, screamed for Jonathan. But the room didn't echo. It absorbed. When the door returned, it opened to a hallway she didn't recognize. The air stank of ash. At the end stood a mirror. She approached. It showed her as a child, standing beside the iron cradle, smiling. Then, something changed. Her reflection blinked, but she hadn't. The child version of herself turned slowly to face her, opened her mouth. Inside wasn't a tongue, but a swarm of tiny black moths. Clara stumbled back, and behind her, Jonathan's voice. She's waking. She remembers us now. Clara turned, furious. What the hell is going on here? Jonathan's face was slack, emotionless. You felt it, didn't you? He whispered. The call. She shook her head. I came because you said you were dying. He took a step forward. I am. Every day I resist, I wither. But if we complete the rite, we survive, together, like they meant us to. What rite? She asked, backing away. He only smiled. Your blood unlocks the door. Mine keeps it open. The house told me. She showed me what lies beneath. Clara slapped him. Hard. The sound echoed like thunder. The house groaned. Lights flickered. Something growled from within the floorboards. Jonathan looked down. Then up at her. And began to laugh. It wasn't Jonathan's laugh. It was Elijah's, or older. Something using his throat like a worn instrument. Clara ran. Back into the nursery. Through the mirror hall. Into the dining room, where she stopped. Cold. The altar. Black. Ancient. Wet. Fresh blood. Dripping from its grooves. Her name carved into its base. Silareshi. Turned to flee, but the door closed by itself. The house had chosen. She wasn't just a guest. She was the final piece. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her childhood bed, arms crossed tight, waiting for sunrise, but it never came. When she peeked behind the curtains, the sky outside was still black. Not night, but a void. No stars, no wind, no moon. Just absence, as though time had been paused or erased. The house had sealed. No phone service. No signal. The landline spat static. And the clocks, all 6 of them, were stuck at 3:33. She tried to leave. She packed her bags in shaking hands, shoved open the front door, only to find the same hallway beyond it. The corridor she had just walked through. She shut the door, opened it again, still the hallway. She tried every exit. Kitchen door, back door, basement stairs. Every one opened into somewhere within. The house had swallowed its own exits. Jonathan, of course, was nowhere. His room was empty, but the bed was soaked in something dark. A trail of blackened footprints led from his room down to the basement and stopped at the door. The knob was cold, wet, Breathing, Clara didn't enter. Instead, she turned to the shola. Journals, dozens of them, stacked in the library. Diaries from Moorfields long gone. Each entry stranger than the last. The walls hum when the altar is near full. I saw myself outside the window today, he waved. Grandmother said I must blind the piglets so the cradle stays sleeping. The house is not haunted, it's hungry. One journal in particular was leather-bound in skin. Inside was Elijah's handwriting, obsessively neat. Entire pages filled with ritual sequences, offerings, incantations, and always, the phrase, "Only the bound may enter." Clara didn't understand what it meant until she found the genealogy chart. A twisted tree of the Moorfield. Bloodline, names struck through. Notes beside them. Defied the altar, devoured. Incomplete offering, house retaliated. Then she saw her name. Clara Evelyn Moorfield. Next to it, final seal, necessary vessel. Must return by 34th. Year, her birthday. Was next week. Panic set in. She ransacked the kitchen for knives, candles, salt, anything that felt protective. She marked symbols on her door like she had read in the journals. Symbols for binding, for banishment, but nothing could hold back the dreams. That night, the cradle returned. This time she wasn't watching it. She was in it. Paralyzed, cradled by invisible hands. Above her, the ceiling peeled open to reveal a mouth. Not metaphorical, but flesh and teeth and lips as wide as the room. It whispered into her brain, not ears. "You will be my voice. My skin, my gate." She screamed herself awake, only to find her hands soaked in blood. Her own? She couldn't tell. Then, the walls began to move, not shake. Not rumble. Move. Like muscle flexing under skin. The house wasn't haunted. Elijah was. Right, it lived, and it was reshaping itself. Closing escape routes, expanding the altar chamber, making itself ready for the right. And in the center of it all, Jonathan. Clara found him in the chapel. A forgotten wing of the estate that now gleamed with fresh black candles and walls inscribed with script older than English. He was kneeling in front of the altar. Naked, shaved, eyes completely white. "Jonathan," she whispered. He looked at her, not with recognition, but reverence. "She chose you," he murmured. "She waited for your blood." "I'm getting us out of here," Clara said, trembling. "No," he said gently. "You're getting her out. She's been bound. Too long. She needs a vessel. She chose us, together, one of voice, one of form." He reached toward her with bloody hands, and that's when Clara saw it. A black sigil carved into his chest. Not with ink, but knife. A mirror of the one now forming on her own. Palm. Matching. Linked. He had bound them. And now the ritual had begun. Clara ran, through corridors that changed behind her. Doors disappeared, windows revealed brick walls. Hallways looped back into themselves. It was a maze now, not designed to trap, but to wear her down. The walls whispered things in her own voice. Childhood secrets, guilt-drenched memories, twisted lullabies. Every corner she turned, she felt closer to something ancient. And inside her own skin, she could feel it now. Something moving within her, not metaphorically, not psychologically, literally. When she pressed her hand to her belly, it pulsed. That was the cradle's truth. It didn't need a room. It didn't need a ritual space. It needed a womb. And Clara, the last Moorfield, the final seal, was to become the gate through which something unspeakable would be born into this world. She confronted Jonathan in the mirror hall. He was waiting for her, kneeling, smiling, weeping. "You should be proud," he said. "We were chosen. We aren't cursed, Clara. We're blessed. You mutilated yourself," she spat. "You lost your mind. This isn't salvation, it's infection." Jonathan touched his chest reverently. "She feeds us now. I haven't been afraid in days, and soon you won't either." But Clara had never been Jonathan. She didn't break. She burned. She set fire to the east wing, tore down curtains, lit the ancient drapes with oil and spark. As the fire spread, the house screamed, a long moaning groan that came not from wood, but from the mouth beneath the basement. The house bled. From the walls, thick black ichor oozed. It smelled like copper and dead roses. Jonathan shrieked and collapsed, clutching his chest, sobbing, "You're hurting her." "Good," Clara hissed. She sprinted through the smoke toward the cellar door. The sigil on her palm burned. It guided her down the stairs, past the broken family portraits, into the place no Moorfield had entered alive in 150 years, the womb chamber. There it was, the real cradle, not a piece of furniture, a structure, flesh, bone, ribcage walls. A living thing, half sunk into the earth like it was feeding off the core. In its center, an umbilical altar, pulsing, waiting, ready. And surrounding it, the others. Every missing Moorfield. Silent, rotting, staring. They hadn't left. They hadn't fled. They had joined her, voluntarily or not. Their bodies bent into knots, arms outstretched, skin fused into the walls, feeding her. Fuel for the next awakening. Clara fell to her knees. The mark on her palm flared like a flame. Voices filled her head, not screams but pleas. From her ancestors, from the house, from the thing beneath. Let go, accept, you were made for this. But Clara had studied psychology. She knew how to rewire belief. She knew what it meant to reclaim the narrative, and she had. Read Elijah's own words. The cradle needs us bound, but if the vessel breaks herself, it starves. Clara lifted a rusted shard of mirror, gritted her teeth, and carved the sigil from her own flesh. Pain was indescribable, pain that ripped through the bloodline itself. The cradle howled. The chamber shook. The walls bled from every pore. Clara collapsed, but not before hurling the shard into the altar. It pierced the core, and the house shrieked. Not collapsed, not crumbled. It died. The walls turned gray. Flesh turned to ash. The screaming stopped. Silence. Not peace, but silence. Clara awoke outside. Dawn overhead. Cool grass beneath her cheek. She lay in front of the burnt ruins of Moorfield House. Jonathan's body was never found, but deep in the ashes, the iron cradle remained, untouched, unburned, waiting. Clara was found 3 days later, naked and unconscious, at the edge of the forest. A hiker stumbled across her collapsed body near a ravine, skin pale, lips cracked, with half-healed lacerations in the shape of an ancient sigil carved across her palm. When paramedics arrived, she screamed once, a sound so guttural it made one of them vomit on the spot. Then she went silent, eyes open, locked on something above them all. Something no one else could see. At the hospital, she spoke only once in the first 48 hours. It's not dead. It's just dreaming again. Psychiatrists assumed psychotic break, possibly linked to past trauma or exposure to toxic mold from the ruins. Her blood work was clean. No alcohol, no drugs, no known hallucinogens. But her EEG scans lit up like lightning storms. Activity in brain regions that should not be conscious, especially not during wakefulness. There were anomalies they couldn't explain. Her core body temperature fluctuated without cause. Her vitals remained stable even when she refused food and water. Her dreams, when she finally slept, triggered seismic microshocks on instruments in the hospital basement. The nurses called her the Storm Girl. They discharged her 2 weeks later with a cocktail of medications she never took. She didn't need pills. She needed to disappear. Clara moved 3 states away, changed her name, cut off all contact with surviving family, got a job shelving books at a university library under an alias, avoided media. But the story had already gone viral. Burned heirloom estate tied to missing persons across century. Final Moorfield found alive, claims house was sentient womb. Psychic inheritance or mass hallucination, YouTubers. Paranormal. TikTokers, Reddit threads dissecting every interview. Self-appointed historians publishing genealogical deep dives on the Moorfields. Journalists dug up police reports, property records, hidden lawsuits, and mental institution logs. What they all failed to notice was the timeline. Every 137 years, something happened at Moorfield House, first in 1691, then 1828, then 1965. Each time, the family thinned, disappeared, and the estate went dormant. Clara had burned the house in 2025. Exactly 137 years later. Pattern was complete. She was supposed to be the final vessel, but now? She was something else. At night, in her new apartment, Clara began seeing shadows move in reverse. Books whispered when her back was turned. Water refused to boil. Sometimes, the mark she carved off her hand reappeared, only to vanish by dawn. She kept a journal. Like Elijah. One entry read, "I think I am not Clara anymore. Or maybe Clara is just a cocoon. And the thing I carved out of myself, maybe it didn't die. Maybe it crawled deeper." Then, 3 months after the fire, she received a package. No return address. Inside, a single item. The iron cradle untouched, cold, silent. But when she set it down on her desk, the floorboards below her pulsed. Once. Like a heartbeat. She buried it in concrete, moved again, but it keeps showing up. Once in her mailbox. Once in her freezer. Once inside her locked car. She no longer sleeps, because in her dreams, she sees children with no faces, and they sing in Elijah's voice. The blood may burn, but the cradle will always find a mother. Centuries ago, before the Moorfields claimed land, before they became a dynasty of wealth and madness, there was a name that passed only through whispers: the Lurha Covenant, a secret sect of midwives, occultists, and blood-binding women, who claimed that birth was not simply a biological event, but a ritual gate. The womb, they said, was the only true portal. And if shaped correctly, with the right bloodline, the right traumas, and the right devotion, it could become something far more terrifying than any altar or scripture. It could become a cradle of arrival. According to records hidden in the Vatican's Forbidden Codex and fragments found in the ash scrolls of Khazaret, the Covenant attempted only 7 births across history. All ended in mass death, or worse. But one survived. In the year 1444, a woman named Isolde of Vreth birthed a thing with no mouth and 2 hearts. She died screaming. Her village vanished in 48 hours, and her surviving daughter, pregnant during the catastrophe, fled north. Under a new name called Moorfield. The name was anglicized, broken up, watered down, but the blood remained intact. What the world knew as the Moorfield family was never a cursed dynasty. It was a farm, a breeding ground, a line carefully curated, generation after generation, through incest, selection, arranged marriage, and trauma, all to keep the cradle ready, all to prepare a womb strong enough to survive the arrival. And it nearly worked, until Clara broke it. Or so she thought. Because the cradle is not a thing you destroy. It's a force. It attaches to lineages. Yes, but also to grief, madness, shame. It mutates in belief, grows in despair. And Clara's rebellion? It was part of the ritual, the final step. The line had tried blind obedience for 600 years. But the cradle needed will this time, resistance, sacrifice. By carving the mark out of her flesh, by defying blood and fate, Clara became the perfect vessel, not bound by the cradle, chosen by it. In the months that followed, strange events echoed across the country. A preacher in Utah birthed a tumor that whispered in Latin. A child in Massachusetts began sketching the sigil Clara carved. despite having no known connection to her. In a psychiatric hospital in Arizona, a woman declared, "The cradle moved into me. It liked her, but it chose me." Clara, now 30, never had children. Or so she claimed. But deep in a forest in northern Vermont, authorities recently discovered a hidden shelter. No electricity. Walls covered in blood drawings. Cradles made of bone. And inside, a child, genderless. Pale, smiling with too many teeth. When asked their name, the child simply said, "I'm home." The investigators vanished. And now? Now the cradle isn't hiding. It's spreading. Because every nightmare Clara survived, she passed on. Every rebellion she made against fate became part of the new gospel. The cradle isn't bound to one house anymore. It's an idea. It can live in any family, any child, any mother. Even yours. So, next time the floorboards pulse beneath you, don't assume it's your imagination. It might be the first heartbeat, and you just might be the next vessel.